Welcome to Loop TV. I'm Gene along with Doug for Tuesday, February 22nd, as in 2/22/22. Our two topics today are Apple navigating Washington with App Store policies and take rates, and separately Truth Social. This is a new app that is sponsored by former President Donald Trump, and it's getting a lot of attention on its launch today. We'll go back to the top as a update. If you haven't been paying attention, Apple had a win last fall related to the trial with Epic. There was 10, I guess, counts on the table. Apple won 9 of the 10. There was a steering provision that they still had to navigate to allow app advertisers to let their users know that they can buy subscription products outside of Apple's walls. This is different than that. This is essentially think of that as the judicial arm. What is news is that earlier in February is that a Senate Judiciary Committee sent a bill to the Senate that is going to allow for changes potentially to App Store policies for everybody. But it takes bigger aim at Apple because their take rates are higher than, for example, Microsoft. And so the bill has not been passed. It's going to the Senate, then it has to go over to the House, and then to the President. And but it has moved forward. And a revelation over the weekend was that Tim Cook had been contacting senators or some of these people on this Judiciary Committee. There's 22 members to get them to vote in favor. I put that simply in the camp that he's doing his job. He's good with people in Washington, and I think that's Apple using its assets appropriately. But I'm going to bring you in real soon here, Doug. The question is, here we are again. It's a different contour to it, the topic, because we're not talking about the judiciary side. We're talking about the legislative side that's actually making laws. And so they can change the laws. All the precedent that is set in the ruling over last fall really doesn't have much say here because lawmakers can change the laws. And I want to bring it to you and say, given the dynamics of what happened in the fall and what's happening now, where does this put the app stores more broadly, not just Apple, but app stores more broadly when it comes to potential legislation?
We've been talking about this topic for, it seems like forever now. And I think the simple answer is you just have to read the tea leaves. And the tea leaves say that app store fees are coming down. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about Microsoft sort of, you could call it preemptive strike maybe, in terms of outlining how they're going to handle their store once the Activision acquisition, assuming it does get government approval, goes through. And they made it very clear that their fees are going to be 15 for game developers, and then I believe it's 12 for app developers. And on top of that, they're not going to force anybody, including game developers, to use their own in-app payment systems. So really, it seems like, if you're building on the Microsoft ecosystem, you can kind of do whatever you want from a payments perspective. You can integrate Microsoft if you want, or you can go your own way. And to me, that just seems like where we're headed with this legislation, which is almost exactly, that's kind of literally what this bill that the Judiciary Committee passed was. It has described.
Well, the bill hasn't passed. The Judiciary Committee passed. It's going to vote.
Yes, it's going to Senate vote. So the bill that the Judiciary reviewed, what they are describing is a scenario where app stores would not have the ability to force app makers to use their built-in payment mechanisms. And that kind of opens up this whole world of, like we described with the Epic case, whether it's steering or literally just installing a different payment mechanism within an app, that sort of ends around some of these app stores. So it kind of changes the business model in my mind.
It impacts the business model in my mind. We have, if you've been following Doug and my conversation over the topic, we both agree that take rates on Apple's App Store are going to come down over the next 5 years. Doug thinks they're going to come down more quickly and potentially sparked by legislative action like we're talking about now. My sense is that the free hand of the market brings it down, and Apple wants to kind of find that right vector. And I think, Doug, you've talked about eventually getting to 15% for everybody. like Microsoft, as you said. And from my perspective, it was gravitating closer to, I think, 20 or 25, something like that, but above kind of where other people are at. And a question which now, we've talked about how the process works here, and agree with you, is that, like, if you're reading the tea leaves, looking at kind of the thunder clouds rolling in, we may get a thunderstorm, we may get some sprinkles, but there's something that's coming, and we need to be aware of that. There is the piece of how, like, what role does, and we probably don't know the answer to this, but what role do lawmakers have in setting exact numbers? I mean, can a lawmaker say that, for example, a store has to cannot charge more than $4 for a pound of sugar? It feels like some of this kind of gets a little bit beyond what the Senate and the House are for.
I don't think that's what's going to happen, though. I mean, just to be clear, what I think, and I feel like this bill has made it even clearer, is that what they're really going after is restrictions on the ability for app developers to leverage their own payment mechanisms and communicate with customers, within apps, legitimate communications, which are very restricted in current App Store policies. And so let's throw out the idea that the government's going to set a rate, because it's probably not. What the government is going to do is say, you've got to open your doors to these communications, and you've got to open your doors to potentially different payment mechanisms, which will enforce or force what you just described, which is, if customers can, developers can come in and use their own payment mechanism, if they can steer, then Apple is going to have to adjust its rates relative to however much friction their technology removes from the process, and leads to a better customer experience and more conversions. I mean, that's basically what's at issue here. It's not the overall number. I use the 15% number as an anchor, just because I think Microsoft's kind of leading the way there. And I would be shocked if we don't kind of get in that territory with Google and Apple sort of voluntarily.
So I thought we were going to take a step forward in the conversation. I think we took a step sideways here, and I think we're probably both in agreement that there's some changes. We are in agreement that there are changes coming. I can't wait to see what happens when the free market, if in fact that this steering is legislated, is allowed. And I suspect that it probably will be, just like you said. I see the thunderclouds just like you do. And I suspect that it will be. And I'm excited to see what that actually happens, how the App Store stands up. I suspect it's going to do well. Our second topic is Truth Social. This is a social network that is founded by former President Donald Trump. If you haven't been paying attention, Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, and he has come back and over the weekend launched for iOS downloads. They have about 500,000 downloads. That is below his 88 million downloads, or 88 million followers he had in his Twitter heyday. And bring you in here, Doug. What do we make of the initial start for Truth, and what does it mean for that platform longer term?
I think for the platform, I'll start in reverse order. I think the platform, beyond just him being banned from Twitter, I think it is an answer to some of the disagreements that people have with how big tech is viewed to be censoring certain kinds of speech. And I think that is a really important thing. So first and foremost, and this is something I've written about, we've written about this in the context of Twitter. We are believers in free speech. I'm a huge believer in the importance of free speech. And, anything that pushes us toward that ideal, I think, is a good thing. As it pertains to Truth Social in particular, the 500,000 on the wait list is, to me, a disappointing number. Like you said, Trump had 88 million people following him. You can say that maybe not all of those were real accounts, but he certainly had tens of millions of people following him. And he had 70 plus million people, I think, vote for him in the last election. And so, the delta there, you could say, is an opportunity for him to get more of those people on board with Truth Social, or you could say it's a tough start. The bottom line to me is, bootstrapping a new social network is a really hard thing to do, especially when you're just trying to replace one that already exists, because really what they're trying to do is do the same thing as Twitter, but it's free speech Twitter.
Yeah.
And when you only have 500,000 people, my concern is you just don't have an interesting enough sort of base of conversation to get people to keep going back to the platform. That's what keeps bringing people back. And if you have these other things out there, Twitter or Instagram or TikTok, people are just going to gravitate where the most interesting things are happening.
What happens if there's a ad campaign and it gets that number up to 5 million?
That could be a little more interesting, but I still think it's hard because you compare the 5 million to the 2 billion DAUs on Facebook, the couple 100 million active users on Twitter, over 300 on Snap. You look at some of these other social networks and you think about the critical mass that's really on those platforms and the ability to communicate with a broad audience. You have to make that decision, right? As someone who's spending their time on a social network, do you want to spend your time on a narrow social network that may have 5 million users? And as long as those 5 million users are people you really want to converse with, then that's great. But if the alternative is, hey, I can go to Twitter and I can hit 200, I can go to Facebook and I can hit 2 billion, right? I think there's a difficult calculus there for users to figure out how do they really want to spend and optimize their time.
Do you need the other side? Let's say we get to the 5 million, where is there a chance it goes vertical, or do you need the other side? Do you need the other side to kind of stir the pot to really get it to go vertical?
You definitely need a diverse set of viewpoints for it to be a compelling platform, in my view. And I mean, we'll see, that thesis could be proven wrong.
I think
But
you're right. I think that's what gets people's hair to stand up on the back of their neck, is when someone kind of gets in their line of thinking.
yeah, I mean, right, it's kind of boring if you go to a platform and everybody's sort of agreeing with one another. In some
Mhm.
ways, I mean, the skeptical me says, well, what's the point of that platform if you got a bunch of people that are patting on the back the whole time? Like, that's not very
Mhm.
exciting. It gets old in a hurry. It's conflict that really gets people engaged, for better or worse. And so I do think you need to have dissent on the platform to make it compelling.
Do you think content recommendations on current big social platforms, do they optimize for that conflict?
To some degree, I think they do. Yes. I mean, I think that if a platform thinks that you lean left or right, they're going to show you more of that content. But I think that that changes over time, and it's certainly changed over the past several years, where I think they've gotten a lot of criticism for, pushing people maybe to go further one side or the other because they keep getting their opinions reinforced by these social networks.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me back to this conversation about what recommendations can be made. It's a tricky path that the big networks have, and puts the bigger platforms, as you said, in a good place. And I'm thinking maybe more broadly. We've talked about some of the division. Tribalism is something that we've noticed for years. I think most people have recognized that as a country, we're kind of moving in these two generally different directions. And is there anything that you think that could ultimately unify us as a trying to be hopeful here, optimistic, unify? Maybe is it some higher goals for the country outside of the U.S., potentially some of the things that are going on international conflict today? Could that be unifying in terms of how we think as a country, or are those days gone?
Historically, war events have been unifying, but I think that they're only temporarily unifying, right? Like, it's not like we're still all unified from World War II. And so I think that the way that politics works is, and this is a Christopher Hitchens quote, but politics are meant to be divisive, and people have different points of view. I think the idea of somehow, quote unquote, unifying the country is probably a false ideal, where our opinions are divergent. And I think that what we're seeing is, extreme ideas are getting a lot more attention, and maybe some of that is fostered and assisted by social media. But to me, I don't know that we need to look for true unity or pure unity, and I don't think the social networks will give it to us. But what I do think is the path to discovering truth, whether it's on True Social or Twitter or somewhere else, is always more speech. I mean, I'm stealing another quote from, I think it was Justice Brandeis, where when he was talking about free speech or any problem you might have with free speech, the answer is always to have more speech. You can only find the truth through discovery. You can't find the truth through, the government or some other authority, whether that be a big tech company or otherwise, saying what can or can't be said, because that means that they're defining truth. And so whatever happens with Truth Social, my hope is that we all do kind of aspire to this free speech ideal, and we see the value in free speech. And hopefully we do a better job of finding it together, even if that doesn't mean true unity.
Well, I can say we're probably not going to get to unity. Like you said, there is one topic that I think there is unity on. It is a great appreciation for all the things that our service men and women do, and most grateful for that. That is an understatement. And we're going to leave that as the final word here on behalf of Doug, Gene, and our gratitude. And Loop TV, bye for now.